My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me today are Chris Fenton, the Dragon Feeder himself on Twitter. I've had Chris on a number of these spaces, but Chris, for those who are not familiar with your background, as we did before, introduce yourself. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved, interested in Hollywood and movie making, and why the focus on China?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's always a pleasure being on your spaces, and I love listening to them also. I mean, your Matthew Pines interview I thought recently was fantastic on the tech landscape and in terms of the challenge that China puts on us. But as far as I'm concerned, my background was really born and raised in the Hollywood business. After I graduated Cornell University with an engineering degree, started in that wax on, wax off type of position at the William Morris Agency, which is now William Morris Endeavor, or traded under the ticker Endeavor on the stock exchange. Learned the art of brokering deals, representing clients in the Hollywood business, writers, directors, actors, producers, financiers, etc., putting together movies and television series. I left there about a decade after I started there and started my own business, doing roughly the same thing, but at a more boutique level. I came across a small commercial production house that was just starting its sort of infant move into becoming a full service advertising agency based in China. I started doing a handful of different projects with them, putting together a couple movies with Chinese financing, which was very unusual back in 2000, 2001. And that relationship grew and grew to the point where they ultimately bought the company that I had built. And I became their head of entertainment as the motion picture group president and also their GM in North America, as we took this Chinese company from roughly, I would say maybe a $30 million type of valuation as a private entity circa 2000, 2001, to one that was traded on the Shenzhen exchange starting in 2014 that ultimately had a market cap of roughly $8.5 billion US. So it was quite a ride, and a lot of the reason we grew that quickly was the amount of expansion we did with partners around the world to penetrate the Chinese market for their products and services. Our biggest forte was definitely that in the cultural space. So we were representing everybody from, say, Michael Phelps and Kobe Bryant, as far as individuals were concerned, brands like Nike and Under Armour and the NBA and NBA China, to partnering with studios in Hollywood to make some of the largest movies of that era and making them work inside a market that was extremely difficult to get into. And our largest hit during my tenure was probably Iron Man 3, which we did with Marvel and Disney. And we broke all records back in 2013, including making $20 million opening day, which was roughly what Iron Man 2 made during its whole run in China a couple years prior to that. So that's my background. Now I'm spending a lot of time really helping institutions, athletes, celebrities, best-in-class companies really try to figure out how to navigate the very complicated nuances of the US-China relationship in terms of still maintaining market access while also being very, very good citizens and putting the priorities of America and Western allies first and foremost in everything they do, which is no easy task, but I'm very hopeful about it. And I'm thankful to be on the show here today.
I know you've gotten involved recently with some things on the Congress side. So I guess how big is this kind of pivot more towards the political end of things directly? And what are you doing with this Select Committee on China?
Yeah, well, I'm an informal advisor to the Select Committee. I've been working closely with Congressman Mike Gallagher, who's the chair, and also a Representative Krishnamurthy, who's the ranking member. That committee was put together at the beginning of this year. It's bipartisan. It is focused on being constructive and practical. If any of you have a chance to check out some of the hearings, I think they've really found their groove. You know, they had one recently with Josh Wolf and Lux Capital and a variety of others that was, I thought, fantastic to listen to about the tech landscape between the two companies. Prior to that, they had China Beige Book on there, which I highly tout as one of the best in the business in terms of diligencing on real quantitative data. That was a fantastic hearing. And I'll be doing one in September based on soft power, influence, censorship, and propaganda. So I'm really looking forward to that. But they are the result of finally a bipartisan consensus that the challenge China poses on the United States of America needs to be addressed in a united form. We need to create leverage in order to push back a lot of overreach and a lot of imbalances in the bilateral relationship. And the bipartisan effort is one that gives me great hope that we'll be able to address this challenge, because it's something that is not going to go away during any of our lifetimes. And it's something that we have to change course on in terms of the recklessness that we've seen witnessed over the past 40 years between the way our companies and the way our country has engaged that country to the detriment of the long-term health of the United States of America.
So you had mentioned two words I want to hear you expand on, sort of the nuances and then the imbalances. There are certain narratives when it comes to China-U.S. relations, when it comes to the traditional medium. And as is usually the case, there's always, using your word, nuances in terms of the way that our relationship has evolved with China and the idea that we kind of need each other to some extent. What are some of the things that you find don't get that much attention, which really is a significant imbalance that impacts the U.S.?
Well, I think there's a lot of quantitative ways to answer that question. I mean, for instance, just in the movie business itself, they have a very protectionist sort of policy overreach on what we're able to get into that market. Presently, they allow roughly 30 to 35 movies a year from Hollywood, or actually from any international producer, into the market. That's very different than a lot of the way a lot of other markets work in terms of being overly protectionist. And even worse, when you do get a movie in there, you get roughly 25% of the box office revenue, depending on how that film does, versus the rest of the world gives roughly 50%. So you're working on essentially a half discounted rate of return if you can even get your movie in there. So that's just one example on a quantitative side of how imbalanced it is. I would say another version of that is the forced JV aspect of how you get your product or service into that country. They require you to set up a joint venture with China. A lot of the times you're setting up it on your own dime, and China has to own more than 50% of it and control most of the aspects of that business. So when you look at the Disney theme park, say in Shanghai, that's 57% owned by Beijing and SOEs under the influence of Beijing, and only 43% owned by Disney and its shareholders. The same thing with Universal Theme Park, which just opened in the last year outside of Beijing. That's 70% owned by China and only 30% owned by Comcast Universal. So those are just two examples of the massive imbalances and areas that we need to reset and readdress in terms of how we engage with them bilaterally.
Right. And I think the point is that, companies have to work within the confines of what China itself is allowing or not allowing. So it has to come from the political negotiation side. How have the lobbyist efforts been over the years in terms of trying to get politicians to put a little more pressure on China to be more open on the business front?
Wow. Well, that's a fantastic question because it's so relevant. So now that you have bipartisan consensus that we have to get serious and address a lot of the challenges that China poses on the United States of America, you have the administration, you have regulatory institutions in the Beltway, you have Republicans and Democrats in Congress all on this case. The only ally that China has that is really muddying the water in terms of getting real effective policy, real effective regulatory status, and real effective laws in terms of how we engage with China moving forward, that only entity that is muddying that water is the business community, is the lobbyists. Those lobbyists are very, very strong on behalf of American companies and also on behalf of Chinese companies. It's a big reason why we still haven't seen, to this day, one of the most damaging social media platforms to the United States and to the West, TikTok, not banned at this point the way that India did several years ago. There are lots of lobbyists working on behalf of ByteDance and on behalf of TikTok to make sure that never happens.
All right, the TikTok side, I want to expand on a bit here, but I want to keep going on this point about the business community. the narrative coming out of COVID was we need to do deglobalization. Too many supply chain disruptions are coming because of our relationship with China, and we've got to be more independent from China. And I don't hear any of that the last 6, 12 months or so. And has anything changed in terms of the level of dependence that the United States has on China post-COVID, or was that just old talk?
Well, look, COVID was a major wake-up call for us in so many ways. Just the idea that all our antibiotics, or a majority of them, are manufactured inside China. A lot of the pharmaceuticals, a lot of the healthcare, equipment that we need is all sort of locked and loaded inside what is a strategic rival of ours, or maybe something even more nefarious. That seemed to be something that really should have pushed us quicker towards this aspect of what we're now calling de-risking versus decoupling. I don't think even the most avid hawks out there, the most ardent supporters of de-risking, want to get to the point where we completely disengage with China or completely decouple. I am not a fan of the idea of decoupling from China either, but we do need to get very serious about removing a lot of the supply chain issues that we have that are national security problems from that market. And we've been very slow to address those. Some of that is because of the muddiness of the way lobbyists are creating a lot of havoc and chaos inside the Beltway. Other reasons are because it's very complicated to disentangle those type of supply chains and get them set up and operating back here in the United States or nearshore allies. So to answer your question, I think the wake-up call was extremely strong and alarming, but we have been slower than I'd like to see in terms of addressing it. But it is getting addressed, just too slowly.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going with it too, right? Because you can't do it overnight, and even if you do it gradually, then China sees it's happening gradually, so they start taking countermeasures, right? So it just seems like the hope, the narrative around that is almost impossible to fully, turn out to be true.
That's 100% the case. I mean, as China notices our quote de-risking from their market, they're actually accelerating their ability to de-risk from our market, de-risk from a lot of the West. So we're seeing this two-sided sort of push and pull occurring. We want to be ahead of them. We don't want to be caught in a situation where they're pulling some of their important supply chain aspects away from our ability to utilize them before we're up and running and ready to go. And even today, we saw a Reuters report about how they're going to restrict our access to a lot of the components we need military-wise in terms of our drone programs, which is quite scary. I mean, some of those areas involve laser usage, communication aspects, and various other things that, quite surprisingly, we haven't figured out how to produce here in America or on Allied soil.
Another aspect of what they're doing, which I think dovetails nicely with sort of transitioning towards what you just mentioned around TikTok, is making it so that a younger generation doesn't see China as a threat and maybe sees their own country as more of a threat. Talk about some of the things that you've seen and some of the analysis and research around how TikTok is impacting the culture of a younger generation because of what the algorithm is showing.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area that is almost too nuanced to show what is really a slow-moving train wreck and has been hard to grasp by politicians to get enough of a groundswell of momentum from constituents and donors to really push through legislation that would ban the app. What you're seeing, obviously, from Beijing is this long game that they play. And the ability to influence the youth of America through TikTok is the one that I think is the biggest danger of that social app. I mean, a lot of people talk about, well, where's the data held? What are they doing with that data? Is there AI technology that can go into that data and help damage us down the road, et cetera, et cetera? That's a big issue, no doubt. But when you realize people under 30 get a majority of their news disseminated from the TikTok platform, quite frankly, is very scary by itself. But the fact is, they can throttle information and they can amplify information very easily through the app. The same way, say, Facebook can do it or Instagram or whatever. But those apps happen to be American born and raised and run by Americans or various allied nations. This one happens to be run and controlled by Beijing because ByteDance owns it. And they have the ability to really pour gasoline on a lot of the issues that are dividing America. And it's hard to see as it happens over time. But I can guarantee if you look at the timeline from when it came online in 2016 to where we are today, you see the support and the beliefs that being American is sort of the pride and joy of the youth of this country. That aspect of the youth psychology has greatly disintegrated over that period. I mean, I think there was a study out recently that it's dropped from something like 40% down to 16%. It's a terrible, terrible stat. And yes, you can blame it on a variety of different external culprits. But when you look at how many kids are utilizing TikTok and how easy it is to sort of switch channeling and throttle and amplify information on there, you can see what the danger is in terms of how it perniciously can influence young people. And that is where I think we really, really need to be careful of. And just, a perfect example of what I mean by this is there's been studies where you can take a progressive or a liberal leaning friend or a mother-in-law and change the cookies and settings on their Facebook app and allow it all to deprogram from left-leaning narrative and news and information to right-leaning. And you can actually change somebody's perspective on what they are politically over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, right? That's a pretty quick change in how you can get people to see things in a different perspective. So just imagine that in the hands of a foreign nation that is not our ally. That is the big issue. And that's the issue that India took on several years ago and decided we cannot allow this app inside of our nation.
I shared it, and that's the tweet you put out a few days ago, basically leading to this idea that that's why a number of younger Americans are not extremely proud, in quotes, of being American. It is interesting to me because it seems like people know this, but they're either not acting on it or they're afraid of losing their voters, right? It's like, I remember, I forget when this was, but I had put a tweet saying, no Democrat, because I think it maybe leans more left, so you can be wrong with that. No Democrat wants to ban TikTok because that has implications on their voter base. The voter base is younger, and maybe that causes sort of an interesting skew in terms of political leaning. Is there any way to get Congress to actually do something about this, to put some other pressure? I mean, we saw the hearings not too long ago, but it seems like it just kind of came and went.
Yeah, I'm hopeful we're going to get there. It's painstakingly slow, but it's really one of the issues is that it is a long-term problem. I mean, Beijing plays the art of war. They're on a 25, 50-year, 100-year plan. And it's very hard to see how this information and the way we're digesting it is affecting Americans. And obviously, like a lot of people commented on that tweet that I had out the other day that, well, Donald Trump was elected president around that time, and that's why it happened. But let's face it, I mean, Donald Trump, you could argue, was sort of a symptom of a deeper cold that's been occurring inside of this country. And obviously, yes, he's conflated and created all kinds of other issues there, regardless of what political side of the aisle you're on. I think you look at the rise of Bernie Sanders or the rise of Donald Trump back in 2016, and you can see there was a reason for both of them to come up. But at that same time, we also had TikTok released here in the United States, and it created a great opportunity to gasoline and gaslight everything that was coming out of the dialogue between those two candidates and what was going on here politically. So I think we really need to look at how this behavior changes from any sort of influence from any of these social media apps, but then apply the fact that the argument of, well, Facebook has all this data and Twitter has all this data and they can influence you to do X, Y, and Z. Well, I don't buy into that because Beijing doesn't control those apps. You could argue maybe Beijing has a little say in what Elon does because he has such a big business in China, but he ultimately, and the way that's run is here on nearshore platform, nearshore technology, and they're not going to be influenced directly from the Chinese Communist Party, whereas TikTok can be. And let me just expand it upon the soft power censorship and propaganda that Beijing puts out there outside of their nation. Now, keep in mind, inside their nation, their goal is to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. But outside of their nation, they're trying to control the narrative of what Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party does as far as a system of government that works for their people and could work in terms of the global system. So if you watch, say, Marriott or American Airlines apologizing for having references to Taiwan on their website, or John Cena apologizing to China for referencing Taiwan as a separate market, or the NBA having to apologize for what Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets GMs, tweeted out in terms of Hong Kong support back in 2019, or the use of the 9-dash line in movies like Barbie or Uncharted or Abominable from Hollywood, or even the fact that James Bond can never face a villain from China. Remember, there's reasons for that. China wants us to believe what they're having their own people believe. They want people to believe that Taiwan is not a separate, independent country and nation with sovereign rights. They want people to believe that the China system works so well that, heaven forbid, there'd ever be a villain from China. They want people to know that Hong Kong is theirs and their right to take that over 27 years early, by the way, in terms of the way that the construct between Great Britain and China was in 1997. So you're seeing this push of propaganda and censorship from Beijing trying to win over the consciousness of the rest of the world. And TikTok is just one of those devices that's helping do that. Well, Western unity, I think, is 100% needed in order to properly address this challenge. That's the part that's most disheartening when we see, I think, a lack of leadership from the United States, because we really can't get everybody all on the same page, and other nations sort of taking it upon themselves to figure out, okay, well, if the United States isn't going to lead exactly how we engage moving forward and what kind of guardrails we have with China, let's just do it ourselves. China loves that. I mean, they love the art of war and divide your enemy. And that's what they're doing to us, not just inside the United States, where we have the business lobby warring with the Beltway on what to do in terms of China, but our own nation is having trouble with our own Western allies trying to corral everybody together and get unified on how we're going to push back on what is a real over-encroachment and an imbalanced relationship with the West that they have with China. So we do need to figure out a way to unite on this. And I'm just going to add that I adamantly believe the United States and China either continue to coexist through the bond formed by the exchange of what I see as culture and commerce. I like culture because it creates an aspirational quality to democracy and has emotional attachments. It has human connection. And in commerce, obviously, is transactional. But when you combine the two, they're a very potent glue between two countries that might not get along. But we need to really continue that bond of culture and commerce exchange, or we're really going to consciously start a true war or a cold war between these world's two superpowers. So we can do that. We just need to unify on how we're going to construct the right type of guardrails, how we're going to make all our companies and institutions good citizens for the West in terms of how they engage with that market and what they're willing to do to help essentially support the foundation of the values and principles that we have and hold dearly as Americans and different people from Western allies. Because if we don't figure out those guardrails, if we don't figure out how to push back in the right type of way while continuing exchange, we're essentially going to lose our version of free market capitalism. And it's going to be taken over and commandeered by that of China and the China system. So we either try to protect that and protect that foundation, or we're voluntarily trying to move towards more of a China system globally. So the only way to do that is unified. United we stand, divided we fall. So it's a great question. And I'd like to see real leadership come out of the United States, which is not easy. And I'm trying to be a part of that cog in the wheel to to help see if there's solutions that maybe I can help brainstorm with some of the important people inside the Beltway. But we need to lead, and we need others to get on board and feel like they're a part of this process from our allied nations around the world. Otherwise, China's just going to continue to divide us, and we're not going to be able to solve this problem.
It helps that you're competent relative to our policymakers.
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I think there's two parts of that question. Number one is, can we play on that in terms of maybe creating some instability inside the China system? I know a lot of people believe, and you probably know a lot of them too, but a lot of people believe that we can essentially infiltrate the psyche of the Chinese people and have them eventually overthrow what is this Chinese form of government and Xi Jinping and his standing committee at some point. I find it a lot more difficult to believe that's possible, at least in the short term, mainly because of their control of information. I liken it to imagine America where the only source of news was Fox News, or the only source of news was MSNBC. If that's all 99.9% of the people watched and heard and got their information from, they would form a certain opinion that would be very hard to break through if you're from a dissenting type of perspective. That's the way it is in China. That Ministry of Propaganda that reports directly to the Standing Committee is very, very powerful in the way they program what's being seen on CCTV networks or on the regional, provincial networks or in movies themselves. So that's number one. Number two is, I think Qin Gang and some of these really fascinating, mysterious sort of cracks in the armor that are occurring without any explanation only show how much more murky and unpredictable and impossible it is to value what you're doing in China in a way that should prevent anybody from putting all their eggs in that basket. It blows me away to watch CNBC every morning talk about investing in China, talk about the goal of investors in China to get involved with different publicly traded companies or get involved with different private entities and VC operators trying to find good places to park their money inside of China. It's hard to believe that people can do that knowing that diligencing these investments is almost impossible to do, especially now after the raids on the various Bains and so on and so forth. I mean, the ability to properly diligence investments in that market is very difficult. I'm not saying it's a bad place to invest overall, but the lack of ability for investors to put the huge wild card, that huge what if scenario into how they're placing a true value on where they're putting their money inside that market is dumbfounding to me, because that is a wild card that you have to think about every time you invest in that market. So I'm not saying avoid the market. I am saying you need to place a real risk value on what you're doing there that is way different than almost any other market. And the symbolism of a Qin Gang just sort of disappearing the way he did, or the way you see, say, Jack Ma suddenly disappeared for as long as he was, that only emphasizes in a symbolic way of the kinds of stuff that can occur inside potential investments that investors are looking at that they can't properly diligence. The wild card sits there, and it's so different than almost every other market on earth.
Speaking of wild card, that's a good transition actually to one of the questions that was tweeted here. If you can ask about the probability of a war regarding Taiwan and implications. So this is, to me, the ultimate wild card, and obviously it's no laughing matter, but that point about investing in China is and not knowing sort of how these variables come into play makes it challenging to get some persistent momentum there. But what are your thoughts on the China-Taiwan conflict, which seems almost like it's inevitable?
Yeah, it's quite scary in the fact that Xi Jinping has been very vocal about his wanting to reunify Taiwan with the mainland. He has not hidden that motivation and that agenda item at all. It's almost similar to the way that Putin pretty much talked a lot about his intentions on the Ukraine front too, and lo and behold, he sort of carried those through. So it's scary. The question is when is he thinking of doing that? And the longer the timeline, the better for us, because as you know, we're trying to create this porcupine effect that really makes it difficult for him to believe he can pull it off without a lot of pain. In the process, it hopefully gives us a lot of time to create the de-risking of vital supply chain issues that we have tied up with Taiwan and China prior to it occurring. My hope is that it never happens, that it's just a threat that keeps Taiwan slightly in line with Beijing's priorities, yet never gets to the point where they actually do something, I would say, similar to what they ended up doing with Hong Kong back in 2020. Because if they do that, we're going to face an issue where we're going to have to decide, okay, how are we going to engage with this market moving forward? Are we actually going to go to war over it? I think that's going to be a really difficult question for the American people to support. It's very far away. It would require a lot of resources that we need to replenish in order to pull it off. And it's also a pretty foreign entity idea to a lot of Americans. In fact, it wasn't until 2016 that I really started to understand that Taiwan wasn't formally recognized by the United States of America. It doesn't have an embassy here. It doesn't have consulates. It's sort of this weird strategic ambiguity aspect and policy that we have with that market. And I'm somebody who's been dealing with China since 2000. So if it took me a while to understand the complications around Taiwan, I'm not asking the average American who has plenty of other things on their plate to try to figure it out either. So I do worry about the wherewithal and the excitement that we would have to support a war supporting that country, and especially if our allies refuse to step in. And it's been interesting watching Congress do war games with their members, seeing how a lot of the different variables would play out, because most of them don't play out very well. So assuming we don't actually back Taiwan, or we don't annihilate the world with some sort of World War III, then what? Are we still engaging with China and saying we're okay with what happened there? What do the businesses, the products and services that rely on that market, the investors, the shareholders, what do we want to do in terms of moving forward with China after they make that type of action work? And that's the better case scenario, because that means we didn't go to war and start World War III over it. It meant we're okay somehow with them taking over Taiwan. And now we're just figuring out, well, what do we do with China moving forward? So it's a huge wild card that's sitting out there. My hope is we have at least a decade to figure this out. But there's a lot of people inside the Beltway and inside the Pentagon that believe we don't have that amount of time to figure out how to address it.
So really, please make sure you follow Chris Fenton here on Twitter. And if you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. And as always, this will be in podcast.
Thing I was going to say is, anybody that wants to follow me on Twitter, it's not for vanity reasons, but I am going to be involved with a hearing coming up with the committee, the new select committee on China for Congress in September. I love getting interaction from followers in terms of some of the stuff that they feel is very important in terms of the China relationship. So, feel free to always DM me or reach out over Twitter or grab my attention on something that I should be aware of.
On the death side of China, it is this other headline that's been out there is we're all waiting for China to start doing some stimulus, because it looks like increasingly China is maybe entering a deflationary phase. All the narratives around the reopening were completely wrong when it comes to China. Any just thoughts on what's going on economically and sort of their debt situation and why stimulus hasn't been coming out, at least not yet?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of people more qualified probably for that answer, but I can tell you that one of the big underlying issues that's creating, I think, the complications in terms of how they're going to address things is obviously the shadow banking economy and the local regional governments, right? The two of those combined have this debt overhang that is going to be almost impossible to service given how slow the growth is going to be there moving forward. I mean, I think, what was it, a 0.8% increase in GDP over the last quarter, which is not very inspiring, and it can be a real issue for debt servicing on notes that probably are in the 6 to 10% range, right? So one of the things that I think is interesting that a lot of people believe is that the numbers are cooked when it comes from the Central Planning Committee and what Beijing puts out there in terms of growth and various other things. But one of the things that actually creates those cooked books is actually the local, municipal, and provincial governments that are lying on their books about how good their internal growth is in order to service their debt and not have issues with the lenders that are lending them debt to build infrastructure, to build real estate development, commercial development, et cetera, because all of these entities have too much debt and too high a service note to end up taking care of it. So not only does the government have to worry about how they're going to handle these entities that have taken on too much debt in terms of trying to grow their areas within the country, but you also have the people throughout the country that have taken part on the shadow banking front in order to service their own debt. I mean, one of the great sort of interesting plays that Alibaba did was they created the Alipay system, which allowed people to hold on to bank accounts through Alipay that paid higher than what the banks were doing inside of China under the CSRC and the People's Bank. That higher interest rate was because Alipay was then lending out into the shadow banking system to borrowers that were using those loans in order to simply service the note and the interest rates that they had on prioritized loans ahead of that shadow banking loan. So you have a lot of consumers and a lot of public interests and public governments with bank loans that they cannot service given the growth that's occurring inside of that country. So it's a real conundrum for Beijing to figure out how they're going to properly deal with this, how they're going to deal with it in a way that doesn't create inflation. And in the eyes of deflation, is there a potential that it actually creates a deflationary spiral that really causes major debt problems? So there's a lot of people that are really trying to analyze exactly what might be the best way forward, but it's definitely showing a huge Achilles heel inside of a system that right now is trying to tout it as the globally best system on earth. To the second question, I would say no. That's all done and over with. It's unfortunate, but I think the globe's attention on that problem back in 2019, 2020 was completely distracted by the COVID outbreak, and what's done is done. So now we have to focus on Taiwan and make sure that doesn't end up in the same sort of case study path. On the first question, what are they doing better than us right now? Well, I just moderated a panel on July 14th for Congress on AI technology and policy and regulatory and initiatives directed by the US government. And I can pretty much say that unanimously with the experts that I was moderating, I am not an expert in the space. I was just simply trying to corral many experts on keeping things focused for Congress. All those experts believed that China was way ahead of us in terms of how they're looking at AI, how they're supporting it, how they're actually directing it from Beijing, how they're properly regulating it, and what their policies are moving forward, and how they're going to create a best-in-class version of AI that's going to allow them a true sort of domineering stance in that technology over the world. That is just one example of a place that I think they are progressing faster than we are and might actually have aspects of that technology that are better than ours. But just to go back to where I was, I guess, 20 minutes ago, I thought it was interesting just simply to see how reliant we are on certain drone technology, on what China has been able to build as far as supply chain aspects that we're reliant on. So I do think for the most part, they look at our old playbook from the early 1800s and how we were supporting our American infant industries by looking at Europe and stealing certain IP and doing some certain tech theft that allowed us to build our industrial revolution. They did the same thing to us in almost every category of industry. They stole a lot of our tech. They forced us into JVs where eventually we had to turn over tech and blueprints and various other IP. And then they build upon that in order to accelerate what they're doing domestically there. And in some cases, they've caught us and moved past us in various categories. And in others, they're still behind us. And I think we're hopefully getting smarter in terms of how much we're handing over to them in order to get access to that lucrative market. Wow, that's a good question. It's probably above my pay grade. I mean, we have major dependence on them in terms of financing the debt that we continue to pile on top of our national debt problem and deficits on an annual basis. So we have huge dependence there on them. But at the same time, they have a lot of dependence on us because we can't default on that debt or decide not to pay the coupon or decide not to pay them back because they'll have real economic issues. So
by the way, Chris, I'm glad you mentioned that because you don't often hear that point. It's like everyone says, well, China can just dump treasuries. Okay, we can also not pay them, right? I mean, the reality is it's like who has the real bargaining power? The one that is borrowing, trillions, or the one that's lending it?
Yeah, it's almost like, I don't know if it's a PC term or not, but it's a term from a lot of movies, right? The Mexican standoff. I mean, everybody's got a gun to each other's head, and it's, no one can really pull the trigger on the other one because if they do, they're going to kill themselves in the process, right? So it is one of these weird situations where the deterrent's almost exactly the same on both sides in terms of how to play it out. So I don't see a great reset unless we both decide, hey, together, let's wipe the debt and somehow keep China's economy from falling apart. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but I will tell you one way to think about it long term is we probably shouldn't be spending more than we collect on tax revenues so that we don't have to continue even more dependence on China to buy that debt. Yeah, well, that's a great question. Well, in fact, here in downtown Los Angeles, we have a major $1 billion property that's sitting there mothballed for the last 3 years across the street from where the Lakers play, because that was a Chinese development company that went under. That 40% number, it sounds accurate from what I've read, but what's interesting is that this IOU situation is much graver than that, right? Because when people purchase those pre-sales expecting the home or the condo to be done within 18 months, they actually put a pretty large deposit down, and a lot of them start paying some version of a percentage of that mortgage right as they do that. So they're actually on the hook with banks to be paying for that house to be done before it's even finished. And in a lot of cases now, it's not even getting finished because the developers are under such financial distress. So it's a real problem for the Chinese government to figure out how to fix that issue, because not only are they trying to fix the issue of things that have already been committed to get finished, otherwise they're going to have serious unrest from all those consumers that bought those properties. But on top of it, they're under a lot of pressure to continue some sort of growth in the housing sector. So they have to figure out how to help subsidize or stimulate more building. So they have, a two-pronged issue, with the first one being much more dire and the second one needing to be done, but they can't do anything about that until they fix the first issue. I think to answer that question, it's really about education, and it's what you do on your Twitter feed really well with your followers, but educating as many people on the issue and getting them invested in wanting to fix it is the only way the Beltway ends up getting behind it. Remember, these are people that are voted into their offices or, essentially, picked by the administration or various other individuals to represent constituents. If those constituents are putting pressure on them to address a real problem, that's how it gets done. So educating as many people to put pressure on DC to make the right calls and to do the right thing is the only way it really gets done. And I think we're on our way there, but it's just painfully slow. It just takes time.
And by the way, I appreciate those that, again, keep attending these spaces and respectfully come up with this question, given the insanity that I've seen the last 72 hours. Everybody, please make sure you follow Chris Fenton. I will try to do this again with him fairly soon, and hopefully I will see you all later. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Honored and humbled, and have me back anytime.